Silence is both calming and scary. We sometimes look for silence for both solace or when we're really deep into conversation, and the slightest noise breaks that silence, and honestly, it can be very startling. It can also be very scary because silence can be the absence of something, much like the dark. Nowhere else is silence more effective than in the King Killer Chronicle, more importantly in the prologue to The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. A silence of 3 parts really demonstrates the power of silence and how there's different types of interpretations when it comes to silence in general. And honestly, it really sets the tone for the rest of the narrative. And what I'm going to be doing with this episode is we're going to be exploring a silence of 3 parts and really dissecting it and really figuring out what is the silence, and when it comes to all the parts, what does it make in a whole? Well, why don't we get into the video? The first silence. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence. It was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. If there had been a crowd, even a handful of men inside the inn, they would have filled the silence with conversation and laughter, the clatter and clamor one expects from a drinking house during the dark hours of the night. If there had been music. But no, of course there was no music. In fact, there was none of these things, and so the silence remained. Out of all 3 silences, this is the one that's the most obvious. This is the silence of pretty much nothing's going on. There's really pretty much just ambient noise. No one's really in the Waystone Inn. It's so quiet that if there was wind, you'd be able to hear the sign creaking outside, and I don't know about you, but that must be really quiet to hear things like that. The last time that I had a situation like this was actually when I saw the movie A Quiet Place. It was so quiet in that theater that we could hear people outside of our theater having conversations. On its surface, it just seems very basic, there isn't really anything going on. But when you think about it, what Patrick Rothfuss is really doing, he's actually setting up the world and kind of everyone's just miserable. Normally when it comes to an inn, you think of like people drinking and chatting and having a fun time. But when you think about the context of the narrative as you progress through the story, you realize that pretty much Temerant is in war, and pretty much any able-bodied person that has the ability to fight is gone off to war. So all the traditional people, like the young folks that are trying to drink and wash away their worries, are either in their little towns or they're off at war. They're getting screwed and having to become sellswords, and they're not really going to inns, especially when the roads are so dangerous. And we see this here. We see this in the reflection of the environment, especially when it comes to coat polishing, everything. Everything's already gleaming. There isn't anything to do, and everyone's just stewing and waiting for something to happen, but also everyone's miserable because the taxes have gone up. Everyone's just not outside. Everything's just dangerous. And the first silence is kind of like showing that the world that we're in right now isn't what it used to be, and everyone's just miserable and sad. And honestly, the tolls of war are now catching up to even a small place where an inn or a refuge like this would be kind of kicking a little bit. The second silence. Inside the Waystone, a pair of men huddled at a corner of the bar. They drank with quiet determination, avoiding serious discussions of troubling news. In doing this, they added a small, sullen silence to the larger hollow one. It made an alloy of sorts, a counterpoint. Out of all the silences, this was the hardest one to actually break down a little bit, because for me, it's one of these where it's a blink if you miss it type of situation, but I think I figured out kind of what the silence is supposed to represent. So as we kind of see within the first silence and kind of goes into the second silence, is that within the first silence we know that people aren't really going to inns anymore, and the people that do go try to keep to themselves and try to avoid bad news. I guess it's the no news is good news type of philosophy a little bit here, because when it comes to the story, I think the second silence is almost the silence of ignorance, because when you're compounded by just bad news, war, taxes, death, and just dangers on the road, you just want to shut that out. You want it to be silent for a little bit to enjoy your beer or whatever you're trying to do for a little, peace of mind, because if you just get compounded by bad news all the time, it really is a hard thing. And as we see within the first chapter, we see that old Cobb is telling a story about Taborlin the Great, and everyone's really getting into the story. We even see Coat, interject within the story, and everyone's like, wait, what? This is the first time they really talk to these people, even though he's been here for a little bit. It's one of these things where everyone's getting into it and everyone's kind of having this escapism. But when Carter comes in, that escapism and the reality of just ignorance is bliss at times is shattered as, he comes in and he's all cut up and that scrawl is there, that's dead, and kind of reality comes back in as people are like, oh, it's the bandits, oh, it's this thing. But in the end, it's kind of like that ignorance, that silence that they wanted of just, sometimes you just need to take a break, is shattered. And I think that's kind of the second silence, is you have just the silence of just letting things wash over you and just having this silence of ignorance at times, because ignorance can be you don't know things, or sometimes you just want to shut yourself off on the world. Is kind of a good example, especially when it comes to Coat, which when it comes to ignorance and coming to just the woes of the world, this gets compounded into the third silence. The third silence. The third silence was not as easy thing to notice. If you listen for an hour, you might begin to feel it in the wooden floor underneath and in the rough splintered barrels behind the bar. It was in the weight of the blackstone hearth that held the heat of a long dead fire. It was in the slow back and forth of a white linen cloth rubbing along the grain of the bar, and it was in the hands of a man who stood there, polishing a stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in the lamplight. The man had true red of hair, red as flame. His eyes were dark and distant. He moved with a subtle certainty that comes from knowing many things. The waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the three, wrapped around the others inside itself. It was a deep and wide as autumn ending. It was heavy as a great river smooth stone, and it was the patient cut flower sound of a man who's waiting to die. I think the third silence, even though it's the hardest to detect, is the most important silence. We can feel the silence. I think when it comes to this silence, it actually comes from the individual, and it's their own self-generating silence. This is the silence of sadness and depression. This is a weird feeling where everything feels silent. You can actually physically embody what silence is like. The best way to describe this for people that don't know, because this has happened to me before, is that a couple years ago I went to the World Trade Center, Museum and Memorial, and going in there, you could actually feel the silence. You could actually feel the sadness and the tension in the air. No one talked. It was just this place of mourning, and it was just one of these feelings where you could feel it within the nails and plaster and every object in that museum. You could actually feel, much as like how Patrick Rothfuss describes this feeling where you could feel it in the hearth. You could feel it as if it's this heavy feeling of like a smooth river stone. Even though you can feel it in yourself, it's like this collective experience. It's hard to detect because it comes from a person, and we see this when it comes to Coat, because Patrick Rothfuss is describing Coat, and he's really getting into this person who's just, he's just polishing and just doing the motions. Even though everything's clean, he needs to be doing something. But yet, the sadness, the silence is emanating. It's almost bleeding in to the Waystone Inn. It's bleeding into everyone in the place because it compounds with the first and second, which when you get these three parts, it's going to make a whole. And this is kind of where we get the last line, which this last line is something that's always going to stick with me, because this really opens up the book, and it goes from the book you're about to read is something going to be entirely different than the book you're about to experience. It was the patient cut flower sound of a man who was waiting to die. And these last lines, when it comes to the beginning of the prologue, really show kind of the dire straits of everything, and how each part of the silence, combine together to make an alloy of sorts of just this person's kind of experiences. The first silence, the second silence, and the third silence go together. The first silence is kind of this, everything's bad, no one is outside, everyone's just kind of being to themselves, they're taking everything in and just stewing in like the self-pity party a little bit. Whereas when it comes to an inn, traditionally you're supposed to have things like people are having fun, they're getting drunk, they're playing music, and it's supposed to be pretty much a fun time, I suppose, in an inn. This brings us to the second silence, where we're dealing with kind of ignorance. We're dealing with, we don't want to hear anymore. We're done. We just want to relax and drink ourselves to, near stupor at times, or we don't want to bring anything up because in the end, it can be a hard and difficult thing. And the third silence is that the main character, the person that is kind of behind this bar, the person that we're really talking about, is depressed, and he's kind of in this mausoleum. It's during autumn, and he's kind of in this time where he's just waiting to die. He's pretty much checking off the calendar and waiting for something to happen. And you bring those together, and that's kind of the silence of three parts, because it's one of these things where sadness and depression can play a huge role in a person and kind of their perspective. And it's interesting because when we look at the rest of the narrative, it actually, all these silences completely contradict the fundamental character of Quoth. In many ways, when we see the first silence, we know that Quoth is a bard. We know that he loves a crowd. He loves people laughing and cheering, and he loves playing music. First silence, it's pretty much he shut himself off. He doesn't want music. Everyone's kind of sad and depressed. We get to the second silence. Quoth is a know-it-all. He wants to know everything. He wants to know about the Chandrian. He goes to the university when most people his age wouldn't even be able to go for years and years. He's a person that loves so much knowledge that he's going to break into libraries, but yet when it comes to the news of the world now, he doesn't want to know anything about it. It's kind of like ignorance is bliss, and he's just kind of shut himself out, and the whole town has kind of shut themselves out. And then it comes to the third silence, which out of all of them, I think this is the most elusive when it comes down to it, because when it comes to Quoth, we see moments of his innocence being taken away with the death of his parents. We see it in Tarbean. We see it in a lot of places where he has these moments of depression and sadness, but yet his music, his friends, and he has like the support system of all these people bring him back into reality. We see it time and time again where he has like a net of some sort, and now that net is kind of broken. Yes, he kind of still has one person with him, but is it enough? Is it just someone that's kind of having this self-pity party of one type of situation? And in the end of the day, I think A Silence of Three Parts is a very powerful message. And honestly, it's one of my favorite prologues, because a duty of a prologue is supposed to set up either the tone or a theme that's supposed to have like a through line throughout the narrative. And obviously, Doors of Stone isn't out yet, but we kind of can see this through line where the story that we're reading is a tragedy in many ways, and we're seeing this person's downfall and kind of the self-destructive nature that leads him to the prologue. And for me, I just find that to be so fascinating, and honestly, it's one of my favorite prologues. I love reading it. For me, every time that I read the book or I do a reread, I usually read it out loud. It really gets you into the mood. The darkness creeps in at you, and when it comes to it, things become more silent and more clear, and by the end of it, I'm ready to read the rest of the story and know what's going to happen, and that makes a really good prologue. Well, everyone, what did you think about this? What is your theory when it comes to A Silence of Three Parts? I love to hear your response to it, because it's an interesting thing to have different interpretations of this, and honestly, it's a lot of fun to talk about it and talk about the King Killer Chronicle. Well, everyone, thank you all so much for watching. If you found this video informative, maybe consider subscribing down below. I'd really appreciate that. Well, everyone, like always, may your food and drink ever be tasteful, and may your books be filled with fantasy and adventure. Bye, everyone. See ya.